Kia ora everybody, you're tuning into Dr. Burst from Tamaki Makaurau in Aotearoa. For those tuning in for the first time, the Pavilion project is a wooden structure located in Henderson, and every 2 months it gets repainted by different artists with a new design, with provocation for each artist inspired by the Opanuku stream, which runs underneath the site. The structure itself was designed by students from Unitec in the School of Architecture, and the project is funded by Eke Panuku Development. In this month's iteration of the Pavilion, we have a super talented artist and friend, Erin Forsyth. Now, I've known Erin since I first started painting graffiti in the early 2000s, when I used to go into a retail store called Creep. I used to buy spray paint and some caps, so that kind of got me going. Her character work is incredible, the murals are super intricate, and it's been awesome to see her develop her practice into such an incredible direction. So without further delay, let's crack straight into the conversation because there's a lot of ground to cover. So to kick things off, could you introduce yourself and let us know what you do?
Sure. So my name is Erin Forsyth and I'm an artist and illustrator based in Puki Tāpapa, or Mount Roskill. I focus on natural history and botanical illustration, and I paint murals.
Awesome. And going back to your teenage days, what secondary school did you go to, and were you always good at art?
I actually went to Westlake Girls, of all the high schools in the world, and I was good. Yeah. I got those kind of best in year awards and stuff like that, and was really encouraged to continue pursuing art from an early age.
And what type of art were you creating when you were studying at secondary school?
Visual arts teachers some of them are actually ex-Elam, interestingly. And in fifth form, I remember they chose colonial woman as the subject matter for the entire year. So everybody had to paint things on that theme. And it was mainly painting focused, actually. So we would do some kind of charcoal tonal studies and stuff like that. But yeah, we were really encouraged to paint, which is interesting now, thinking about how that's not encouraged so much now, even in some of the tertiary institutes and stuff. But yeah, I do just want to mention one experience that I had that was really weird, because I had glandular fever when I was 15, really bad, and I was like out of school for months and months and months. And then I could barely walk up the stairs, I was so weak. And then one day I just woke up and I remember feeling like cured or something. And it was really bizarre because I knew that I was better, but I had for several months this ability to see colours differently than I'd ever seen it before. Like if I was looking at an object, I could see the shape of like a reflection on a metal surface or something like that, and I could paint that. So that was cool. Yeah, it was really bizarre. And then I smoked a lot of weed and it went away. But I did have this like just really amazing visual clarity that I hadn't experienced before, but it allowed me to observe things. And I think I'm still affected by that, yeah.
That's amazing. So for the people that don't know, Westlake is out in the North Shore of Tamaki Makaurau. So what was life like for you growing up out those ways as a teenager?
Life on the shore was probably everything that people think it is. But it was the 90s, so it was fun actually. You know, there wasn't a lot to do. You didn't have a phone. You just kind of had to meet people places, and sometimes you would figure that out like weeks in advance. Well, maybe not weeks, but like a week out, you know. People would go to Te Pūtahi Mall on Thursdays and like hang out and just like stare at each other. No one's buying anything because you don't have any money. And then you'd go and try and smoke cigarettes in the bush, and then, you know, hang out and like make weird spells because everyone's watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer and stuff like that. But mostly we were trying to get out of there, and we were trying to like scab bus money to get into town and hang out with folks in the square. And at one point people figured out that there was like a payphone in the square and you could phone it. So we used to do this, we'd like phone the payphone and be like, some random person would answer and you'd be like, how's it going? You know, like, is there many people there today? What's up? And then maybe you'd get the bus over and just like hang out and watch people skate. And yeah, it was pretty cool.
You mentioned to me that as a kid, your nana had a florist shop. What role did that play in your childhood?
Yeah, so my nana had a florist shop in Birkenhead basically from when I was born, and probably before that actually. She was there for decades. And on the bigger holidays like Valentine's or Mother's Day, all of the women in my family would go in to help out. So we'd do really basic stuff like stripping the thorns off the roses so that they could be boxed, and tying ribbons, and Nanny would kind of go through the different plant names and like people's associations with them. And I always found that really interesting, that there was this whole kind of language behind the plants that wasn't really talked about. It wasn't advertised. It was just something that was intrinsic to them, and to people's relationships with them. And yeah, I found it really interesting. I did do like a brief stint in the pet store at the mall and stuff like that. And of all the places like where people seem to feel happy or comfortable, like, because people go to the malls like thinking it's going to cheer them up, but then most of the time you just see people walking around completely miserable. But when people came in to get flowers, it was just a completely different vibe, and the way that my nana kind of used that as a way to connect with people, I thought was really beautiful. I don't know if that says enough about it, but it was always just something that was really special for me.
Absolutely, and I think in relation to the florist shop, we'll come back to that, because in your current practice, you're doing obviously quite a lot of illustration of flowers. But on another note, coming back to secondary school, after you left Westlake, what did you do next?
I left home and I left school quite early actually. Well, I did actually start 7th form, I just didn't finish, and I ended up moving out of home that year instead. But when I was making the decision whether or not to stay or whether to go, like I'd kind of dropped my, like I was a truant, I guess. It's such an old school 1950s delinquent kind of word. But anyway, yeah, we were wagging a lot and going into town a lot. And yeah, I just knew that I needed to leave. And my teachers, the same people, like no shade on them or anything, because they would have only been probably in their mid-20s as teachers. But they were like, you're too young, you won't get accepted into art school. It's not a viable career path, or like a path that's open as an option to you is at your age.
And this is also during the 90s, the mid-90s, late 90s? Yeah,
it'd be like that would be like 97, I want to say. Yeah. So yeah, I didn't apply for anything at that time. And then I heard about the animation course, the freelance animation school, and because I guess at that stage, like, you know, you don't have social media, you don't even have the internet, so you can't see what it looks like to be an artist unless you actually know somebody that is one. And when you're my age on the shore, living in Northcote, there's no example of what that might look like at all whatsoever, other than these teachers who are telling me that it's not an option. So hearing about the animation course and that there's potential to create a career drawing had a lot of appeal to me, and a lot of appeal to other people around Auckland as well that were kind of in similar situations where they were creative but didn't have, you know, a path laid out in front of them as to what that might look like in terms of building a career and being able to sustain yourself as an artist.
And what are some of the things that you learned from that certificate in freehand animation?
So freehand animation is like, you know, like the 1950s rotoscopy stuff. Like just think like old Disney and old Warner Brothers. Freelance was actually set up by Warner Brothers, I think, or they had some kind of really close association so that they could get people from the school to go work for them. So there was like literally a career path through the school if you took it. But basically how animation works is you have the beginning and the end of a movement, and those are your key frames. So if a character was going to be taking a step, you would have a drawing of the person standing still and then of their foot out, and they've completely reached that first step. So those are your key illustrations, and then everything in between that is in-betweening. So you are drawing the different stages between the movements in ever-increasing smaller. So you go halfway, and then then you use a halfway in the first way to go get the quarter way. So that was kind of one of the things, was in-betweening. And then there was character design. So looking at a character or designing a character from like a three-dimensional viewpoint. So you're doing like what's called a turnaround model sheet, where you're looking at something from the back, from the front, side angles, three-quarter angles. But this is all done obviously without the aid of any technology. It's just pen and paper and rulers. So you're using lines to kind of keep the proportions and old school perspective techniques. And then also doing life drawing and stuff like that. So it was really good in terms of a foundation, because it meant that you were actually drawing for up to 8 hours of your day, which is just something that doesn't really happen now. It's crazy, right? I mean, it's crazy to think of it now. But I think it does help in terms, because one of the things that I feel is that discipline is more important than talent. So it's like, it's one thing to have talent, but if you don't actually apply yourself and you don't use it, it's kind of wasted potential. But you can't just jump into doing really long days or long hours on something. You kind of have to build it up with time, like to create the stamina and to create the mental stamina, because it is mentally exhausting to just be concentrating on something for any, it doesn't really matter the subject, but yeah, it's just one of those things that you build with time.
To your knowledge, are there still many people from that course who are still making art now?
Yeah, weirdly, there's quite a few people that I know now, or that I've known since then. So yeah, little Elliot Elliot Stewart was in my year, and he was, I guess, a star even then. Like, everyone in the course knew him, and he would not really draw the things that he was supposed to draw. He'd just draw really cool shit. So people wanted to know him and look at his work. And that was 99 that we were talking about. And to the best of my knowledge, I think Askew went there as well before, like maybe the year before. It was a 3-year course, but I don't know anyone that actually finished the course. Like, most people just did the first year and then were like, I don't actually want to work for $6 an hour drawing somebody else's drawings for the rest of my life. Fuck that. And I think Liam was there, but I'm not sure what year he was there. And then this other woman, Carla, who I know is like, she's still tattooing and stuff. So yeah, a lot of people kind of use that experience in some way or another. Yeah, but it's weird that it's mainly kind of graffiti associated people.
And from the knowledge and skills that you learn from that program, does that still feed into any of the art that you make now?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I observe is that things that I learn take me a while to really fully grasp. So there's concepts that somebody can introduce you to, and it might take years for it to really resonate with you, and then you go, oh, that's what they were talking about. You might read something in a book and then it might just take you a while to really get it. So there's foundational things like looking at negative space when you are trying to create a composition that you might not appreciate at the time someone first mentions it to you. You might be like, why the fuck do I have to do this? And then later on you have when you're applying the knowledge, it becomes real. And I think that's something that's true across creative practice, really.
So jumping from secondary school to animation, what was your introduction to graffiti?
Well, my introduction to graffiti really began on the shore. There was people that would come over. Like, Northcote was not a great area, you have to understand. Like, that's I guess that's one thing that I should mention, is that I think some people cityside have this like idea that everyone's like cashed up and like fucking, I don't know what, like trust fund kids, and that's true of some parts of the shore, but there's also like, the state housing in Northcote was for people whose main income earners are in jail. So that meant that there was all sorts of activity going on, like around the shopping centre, which is right by the school, you know, which is crazy. You know, like my brother and sister showed up to school one day and there's like armed defenders squad like running around and shit, and everyone's like hiding under their desks. And people were dropping out at age 12 to go and look after their like siblings and shit. So this is just like what's happening. And then also like you couldn't like get any support as a young person to move out of home unless you were over 17 or your parents agreed to it. So a lot of kids were really stuck in really negative situations. And I'm sure that that's still happening now, you know, but there's kind of this camaraderie that happens between kids, I think, and you don't really talk about shit, but you just kind of, I don't know, are there for each other. And so you'd go into weird spaces like down like the side of drains or like just wherever to like hang out where you're not going to get in shit, you know, because that's really important for your safety basically. And that's where you'd see tags, you know, tags and throw-ups, but mainly tags, you know, and sometimes it, you know, might be a massive Trojan or like a strict or something that's just like, that's all straight letters on the shore. And it's in these kind of weird spaces where kids are hanging out. So yeah, I didn't know who was doing it. I'd never met or seen anyone doing it. I just was like, wow, there's like somebody's name, you know, and that's fucking cool. And I had an appreciation for it. And then it wasn't until I started like, there's this nightclub, this underage nightclub called P104, which was on Fanshawe Street. And it was like rave music, like happy hardcore and trance and shit. And it was no alcohol, but you know, we'd go and smoke weed, and then when later on we'd go and take acid or whatever. But yeah, it was a place where teenagers could go and hang out almost for free and just like dance till like 3 o'clock in the morning or whatever. And so it was a great place to meet people from other parts of Auckland. And hanging out there one night, I was hanging out with Ape actually, and I knew him from like, yeah, again, like smoking weed at the back of Aotearoa Square. And he just started tagging on the like bow repairs wall that was down there, and I was like, what the fuck? Like I couldn't believe that somebody I knew was doing this thing that I had seen, you know, since I was like 12 or 10 or however, you know, when you first start noticing that stuff. It's like, holy shit. And it really blew my mind. And he was like, oh, do you want to have a go? And I was like, yes. I did this really terrible it took me a minute and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna write mint. And I was like, yeah, cool. And like, it was really bad. But yeah, that was my first experience like with a spray can, and it was fun. It's like, yeah, I could do this all day really.
And what are some of the names you wrote when you first started?
Well, I pretty much went from, I think I wrote mint for like 2 months or something. And then somebody was like, oh, it's too much like Misery. Have you heard of Misery? Like she's the only other, like, you know, another female, because there wasn't many female writers, you know, and it's got the same first letters. I was like, oh, okay, true, you know, I don't want to do that. And yeah, I'd read like Go Ask Alice, which is like this book about, it's like a teenage girl's diary and her experiences with acid. I was really obsessed with acid at this time in my life, and would often feel like, you know, kind of Alice in Wonderland type vibes when I was tripping. So yeah, I started writing Alice, and I kept that up for quite some time.
For people who were not around during the 90s, how would you describe the graffiti scene in Tamaki Makaurau during that time?
The graffiti scene at that time was really fun. You didn't really know who anyone was. There was no way for people to like self-promote, really. It was just like you saw a tag, and if you saw somebody, like it was either you like met someone through someone and that's how you knew. But most of the time it was really anonymous, and it was mainly like tags and throw-ups and pieces. And there were some crews that were active that were like mainly central people, but most people were kind of like individual just taggers, you know, and that was really big. And painting trackside was really big. And yeah, no one was really doing legals. It was all just like stealing paint and doing tags or pens or whatever, you know. It wasn't until maybe like around 2003, I want to say, that people started to really start to get like commercial work from it, and that changed everything quite quickly, you know. Even in terms of people's, it's like, you know, when you look at people's photos from the 90s and like they're really unself-conscious, like they don't know, like it's not like they're like they know what they look like. Like people's graffiti was like that. It was like you didn't really know what it looked like and compared to what other people were doing, if that makes sense. There was nothing, like no mirror to be held back to you.
Just then you said 2003 was the start of the commercial work kind of phase, but what was the catalyst for that shift?
I think I really do need to talk about the square and like what a phenomenon that was, because in the 90s, like, yeah, we didn't have this technology as a way of communicating, but what we did have was like really strong subcultures. And so graffiti and hip hop were really closely linked at that time, but there's also skateboarding and, you know, hardcore and punk and raves and stuff. This is like at the peak of all of these subcultures, and they're all led by youths, you know, and so you're all just like, whether you are, you know, officially part of like a crew or a band or whatever is kind of irrelevant. Like you're part of a culture, and all of these cultures supported one another. Although they had beef, it was like just the fact that it was all kind of so powerful, like gave people like motivation, I think, to really express themselves and to be very anti-authoritarian, anti-establishment. And so the graffiti that was happening was like, you know, pretty ugly and pretty destructive. And obviously council started to get noise from the upstanding members of society to do something about it. And they started looking for ways to counteract that. And one of the ways to counteract that was to have murals in place of the walls that were getting hit really hard. And that's obviously something that is like now is just like a given, but it was kind of new then. And they really were quite smart about it and targeted artists that they knew were respected within the community. And yeah, offered them pretty fucking irresistible deal, you know. And because a lot of people had been wanting to work as artists, this kind of provided the avenue. But it is it was and it is a trade-off, you know, and it's still something that is contentious. But yeah, that whole landscape was just developing. It wasn't really something that had been fully established.
Aside from Ape, who were some of the other writers that you hung out with from the scene?
Well, first of all, like, funnily enough, like Ape and I and some other people had a crew called the Urban Ninjas, which is so embarrassing. But I just want to say because it's funny. Like, basically all of my graffiti career is like pretty cringe. And then Funboy was like a major partner in crime for me for a number of years. We hung out and just stole shit and tagged on shit, and yeah. And then, so that's F is for Fun, if you guys don't know. And I still see him and he's around. But his attitude of just like finding good spots, weird spots, and just like not giving a fuck about what other people think, I find really inspiring still. I like that attitude. And weirdly, just like a little kind of out, like to the side, like how he got his name was like, because another spot that people used to go to was Albert Park, and people would go and hang out up there, and he was going through like the C is for Cookies song, but doing it all different drugs for every letter of the alphabet. And he got to F and he couldn't think of anything, so he said F is for Fun, and that was how his name came about. So shout outs. I know he's not the most loved character, and that probably just makes me love him even more.
Yeah, I mean, Funboy was definitely super up and still gets around today. So from Funboy to RFC, you started hanging out with Gasp, Deos, and Prompt, right?
Funboy and I were basically in the beer fridge at this liquor store, and we saw Deos and Vino and Gasp, and we went and hung out with them, and we were like pushing each other down Williamson and shopping trolley, and like went and got pissed at the headquarters, which is basically Deos's room at that time. And from that I met Prompt, and we were like painting partners for a while and just had some pretty good experiences, like just going out and getting up as much as we could, and yeah, Gasp and I doing the same. And yeah, weekends, Sundays, trackside, no trains were running. There wasn't really anyone doing any security or anything, so you could just like plan to go and like do a piece and then go and do that. I like to do characters, so it was kind of convenient for me that Gasp was a fucking amazing piecer and still is, and so I would do characters next to his pieces, and we were, you know, that would be like just like the perfect Sunday, really. Yeah, it was good times. Like, it's kind of like golden age of all this stuff, you know?
So during this time, would you say you gravitated more towards characters than pieces?
Yeah, totally. Like, that was a whole thing that people don't really talk about now. Like, now people talk about street art and graffiti, but within graffiti, there's like obviously like different things that people wanted to pursue, you know? So I was a character artist. That was the main thing that I had interest in, was painting characters. I did have some pieces that were okay. Like, I think I had maybe like 18 months top where I did like some bangers, but most of it was garbage. Most of it was garbage. And that's cool. I had fun. But yeah, and then there'd be people like, obviously when the hip hop summit and stuff like that started running, then that changed everything, because then there was like 3D artists, and then there was like people that like New Zealand wild style artists like Daft Crew, and that was a very specific thing that they were pursuing, you know. So within the thing there was like little subsets of interest that people were going pretty hard on, and I think RFC is actually quite well known for characters, you know. We're all quite good at that. Yeah, that was kind of a feature, I think, and maybe that is like ties back to freelance. I don't know, you could say that, but I think that the interest with people was there before the education, you know, and before the spray cans. It was like something that people just have inside of them that they are looking for an outlet for.
Was RFC predominantly a central Auckland crew?
I'd say that RFC is pretty like Greyland oriented. Like Sens is like is like the boss doggy, and then Deos, Gasp, Pierre, like there's heaps, you know. There's like your kind of hardcore crew, and then there's your affiliates, and then there was also Prompt had a crew with Wise and like an all-female crew. No shade to like female writers, and in retrospect, like I should have gone with the solidarity. I mean, whatever. Can't I have both? Can't you just have both? And I painted with everyone anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But that was like, I kind of got put on the spot, and then we all just got really drunk and probably went and did some tags. But yeah, it was pretty central. Like most people were like flatting or still at their parents' houses.
So they said you had to join RFC or the other crew. Couldn't you be a part of both?
Yeah, which was funny because Prompt is obviously like running this other crew and then also RFC, so it's like, I don't know, it was just kind of just this culture of like giving everyone a bit of shit as well, you know? Like you gotta take a bit of shit and get talked down to a little bit. Like when you're coming up, you can't expect to just be like, and I like that, you know, shouldn't be too easy.
I hear you, and that probably motivates you to be more active too, maybe, I don't know. But on another note, at one point you also opened up a retail store called Creep. Could you let us know how that kind of came to be?
But yeah, all of this stuff was like happening quite fast, you know, there's lots happening in 1 year, and trying to figure out a way to make money is a constant problem as an artist. that continues, you know. But anyway, at that time I hadn't quite figured it out, and I thought if I started selling stuff that could be a way to get some extra income and support my dishwashing habit. And some friends of mine had a little clothing store on K Road called Moo, Catalina and Tenica, and they were hand sewing and making their own clothes, and the space where it was used to be Virus Clothing, and prior to that it was a goth nightclub. I think actually the woman that ran it might have been the woman that got busted like throwing this dude's body over the North Falls. Like, people don't really talk about this shit now, but like I remember being told that somebody had been murdered at every address on K Road, and I'd fucking believe it 100%, like with the shit that I saw going on back those days. And especially if you think about like the 70s and 80s, man, it would have been wild. But anyway, so their shop like had this little crawl space at the top, which used to be the DJ booth. And so they said if I worked one day in the shop that I could have this DJ booth as my shop. And I was like, yeah, that's cool. So I did that, and I started selling spray paint and caps mainly, and some of my own weird clothes that I made. And yeah, I lived next door at 155 on K Road, and so if people wanted stuff they could like buzz my buzzer, and I'd come down and I'd go up and I'd open the shop and sell them some stuff. And it went on like that for a year or so, maybe a bit longer, and then I did the enterprise allowance grant through Working Income and was like, yeah, I'm gonna have a proper shop, and then took on a lease in St. Kevin's, which was probably like way out of my budget, but I had no business experience. I never even like worked retail except for like this one day a week that I did in my friend's shop, you know, and now I'm like trying to run a store, and the margins on things is like 20%. Like, you know, I don't know how many caps you'd have to sell to like pay the rent for a shop space in St. Kevin's, but I wasn't selling enough. And so another thing that I was doing was also selling people's sneakers, like sale on return, so people could bring in their Jordans or whatever, and and I'd on-sell them. So that was quite cool, and I probably made like more of a margin on that, but it was never really enough to sustain. But I just did it because I loved it, and you know, it was an amazing way to meet people, and to actually support the community that I was a part of. And that's something that has always, you know, like felt really important to me, like, and as part of growing up with that kind of subculture mentality where it's like, okay, well, you know, if you're in the hardcore scene and you don't play an instrument, well, you might be able to draw a cool poster, or you might be able to convince some other people to come along and pay $5 to get into the show, you know. So like, it's like to be a participant is like, what are you bringing to the culture? And I think that's something that was really ingrained in me from people that were senior to me in different scenes, and that motivated me to have my shop. Yeah.
So after Creep closes, you went to Australia. Was that before or after the store?
I think after that I ended up working at the Loft on High Street, which was a sneaker store. Well, it was kind of like a weird thing, like the owner used to own a Sterling Sports, and he realized that sneakers were becoming really cool, so he had this kind of niche-y shop that was in Chancery. Yeah, it was in the Chancery on High Street. So because I had this experience running my own sneaker store, I could now work in a sneaker store, which was cool. So I went and worked there for a while, and my younger sister moved to Sydney in that time. And I went over to check in on her and was like, oh, this is cool. And then I just stayed there. I love being in Australia. I wasn't expecting to. Like, I was kind of just more concerned about her and like going to see if she was okay and stuff. And she was just having a really fucking good time. And yeah, and the scene over there was completely different to what we had here. And in the sense that there was like, I guess, you know, we did have Disrupt Gallery, but that was kind of it, you know, in terms of spaces for people making art that are managed by young enough people to really get what's happening and to show the work of other young artists. and I think that's still an issue here, actually, to be honest. But in Sydney, there is a lot of people that were running studio spaces and exhibition spaces. There was Monster Children magazine had their own gallery space, and they were showing like Mike Giant and stuff like that. Like all the artists from Beautiful Losers and like Ed and Deanna Templeton, all these amazing artists like from around the world, and particularly from the States, whose work you didn't really get to see here. And the actual artists themselves were visiting, like coming to Sydney, and then there's like China Heights Gallery and things like that. And so many of the magazines, like Dazed and Confused or whatever, all of the people that were writing and doing fashion editing or whatever, they were all based in Sydney. Everyone was there, and you'd all just kind of go to the same things on the weekend and to the same bars during the week, you know. Most people were living in Surrey Hills, which is, I think the rent's gone up there quite a lot since then, but at the time it was decent. And, you know, the pay in Australia is obviously very attractive, coming from, you know, not really having any skills suitable to a high-paying job. You know, like I can do retail, I can do like kitchen work, and here like what I would be getting would be like maybe like $15 an hour, and there it's like $22.50, and it's Australian dollars, and sometimes it's cash at the end of the day, you know. So that's like amazing money when your rent's only like $80 or $100 a week. So yeah, like why would I not stay there? And weirdly, this guy Dr. Debo, he's from Warfare Crew, messaged me on MySpace and was like, yo Alice, like what's up, like I see you're in Sydney, like let's catch up for a drink. And I was like, oh fuck, okay, like random, still don't know how he figured that out. But when I met him and his crew at the Gaslight, and we had some beers and yeah, did some painting with those guys for a while. They introduced me to Demote and Perso and Ditchy, who's SWB crew, just like skinny white boys. And then I became really good friends with those guys, and some of those guys were like just starting out their tattoo career. Demote was like working full-time already doing illustration and graphic design, as well as being like kind of boss dog of like Sydney graph scene. And I found it really inspiring to see the way that these people were applying themselves like in their day-to-day lives. Like they were taking it really, really seriously. And Demote would always be like, you know, try and deliver before deadline, try and exceed. Like he had these really good like values and principles that he applied to his work, that I think had like really, you know, you can see where he is today. And that was just from his values and work ethic as a creative. And it was really important for me to see that. Whereas here in Auckland, we'd go to Brazil and talk about being artists, you know, talk about the philosophy of it. But in terms of the actual practice of sitting down and drawing something, and then if it's not good enough, draw it again, you know, and that sort of attitude. I'd only really seen that one other time in my experience here, and that was when I was living with Rose Hardy, and she was doing her tattoo apprenticeship. And I remember just being mind-blowing because she'd drawn this wasp, and it was like full like photorealist, like 3D little drawing of a wasp with different grades of HB pencils. And she'd take it into work, and the guy had been like, nah, this bit's wrong, do it again. And she did, you know. And I was like, fuck, that's hard out. So it just, whenever I see somebody having that approach, I just have so much respect for, like, you can't do this unless you really love, or maybe you're a sucker for punishment, but like, there's got to be something in it that like, you love so much that you're gonna fucking do it. You like, there's no way that you're not gonna do it. You have to do it. And I think this is like an attitude, like people, you know, you see people come and go that like they might be really good for a few years, and you're like, wow, that's cool. And then it's like they get bored, or they realize that there's not a lot of security in it, and they drop off, and you're like, okay, it does change at a certain age. People start to have families, and that really affects the level of responsibility and trying to meet the avenues for meeting those responsibilities as a creative are narrow.
And how long did you stay in Australia for?
All in all, I was only there for a couple of years, and I ended up kind of bouncing between Sydney and Melbourne quite a bit, and here quite a bit. Yeah, and then I did a few shows in Sydney, and I started working for the New Order magazine, which was founded by Aaron Bryce, who was weirdly the guy who had his sneakers in my shop for the whole hour. That guy's an interesting character. I'm sure you guys have probably come across him, but he's still very active doing various things now, I think. But yeah, he was like, I'm starting a magazine, you should be the arts editor. I was like, I've never written anything in my life. And he was like, it's cool, you can do it. I was like, okay. So he had me organising magazine launches in Melbourne and in Sydney, where I'd organise the exhibition and then we'd launch the magazine next to that. So that was cool, and I felt like I was kind of jet setting around at that stage. And I came back to Auckland for his wedding, and I ended up staying, which I was not expecting to do. But yeah, it turned out I had a bit of healing, I guess, that I needed to work on. And I set up a studio space not too long after I'd arrived back. And that kind of became a bit of a responsibility that I wasn't prepared to leave. And I also started to see that there was opportunity here to model what I'd seen in Australia, in Auckland, because people weren't really doing that. And as somebody without an academic arts background, the studio spaces, there was basically no studio space that was available to me. There were some studio spaces, but they were kind of Elam grads, that had already shared studios together in school, that had then set up their own spaces to keep that thing going, But for people outside of that, you couldn't really get in there,
And for the people that don't know, this was Method and Manners.
Yeah. So this is on Upper Queen Street, 6 Upper Queen Street, and it was upstairs from the old electrician shop downstairs, the Electrical Equipment Co. And weirdly, when I used to have my shop next to Furniture for Flats, there was a guy next door who ran Super Trash. I used to buy old record players from him, and then I'd take them and get them fixed by the old guys at the Electrical Equipment Company. So I knew them, and it was this really small old man called Mr. Bond, and he's small because he's worked so hard his whole life that his back is completely curved over and his fingers basically have no fingernails. So you'd go and see him and he'd bring out this big magnifying light thing and look at the thing, and he'd be like, I think I've got a part somewhere, and he'd shuffle out the back. And so I knew this place and I knew the Bonds, and I saw they had this for lease sign in the upstairs space of their shop, and I was like, what the fuck? So I went in, and sure enough, old Mr. Bond was dragging massive filing boxes downstairs. And I'm like, oh, what, you have this sign. And he was like, oh, you talk to my son. And yeah, for whatever reason, they decided to lease it out to me and my group. Although they'd never rented any part of the property. It'd been a family-owned property for over 50 years.
What was the most memorable show or experience you had in that space?
Well, there were so many good times and so many just fucked up times in that space, to be honest. And it went from being weirdly Elam oriented, so that there were artists coming through from this kind of contemporary arts background, and then it kind of ended up being more graffiti oriented towards the end. But when I was in Sydney, one of the people that I met at the Monster Children Gallery was actually Aaron Rose, who produced a documentary. Well, he used to have a gallery called Alleged in New York, and he directed and produced the film Beautiful Losers, and also curated the exhibition that, I'm not sure which came first actually, the exhibition or the film. But yeah, I met him and somehow stayed in touch with him, and he agreed for me to do a screening of that here in Auckland. at the back of the studios, and so I worked with Mad Men Entertainment to arrange that, and to kind of do honour to the people here. I also arranged an exhibition of like 10 local artists' work alongside the screening, and then we had prints available of their work for people, just to kind of say, like, you know, here's this international stuff that we look up to, but we have our own scene right here, and it's been going just as long and just as strong, you know, and I really wanted to give some love to that, give people their flowers, I guess. And Erin did a live stream interview before the film screening as well, and so that was just a really, really nice evening. And the cops came, and there was nothing they could do, and they just were like, have a good night, and we were like, cheers boys.
From memory, who were some of the artists you had in that group show?
Misery, Askew, A.T., Stefan. It was actually quite a weird mix, like it wasn't just graffiti people, but I'd need to actually like look at the list and see, because my memory is kind of shocking. And the other good aspect of that was Haunt was in the studio at the time, and so was Trust Me, and Miso and Brat were there, and so I remember just like waking up in the morning being real pumped, and Nige as well. But yeah, so we like did these big like hand painted like signage things on the gallery walls too. And that was one of the cool things about having a space like this, was like there was nobody to like really set any parameters. Like we didn't have like a fixed calendar schedule or anything like that. It was just like do stuff when you want it, how you want it. Yeah, and it was me. And like we had punk shows up there, like street chant and stuff played up there, Los Titas. It was me.
Wow, that's a really all-star lineup of talent. What were some of the challenges of running a space like that?
I guess one of the biggest challenges that I have with any sort of administration is that I'm not into it. And it's not my forte. Like, it's like I can set up the thing so it's like going, but the wheels tend to fall off because I'm not really like keeping an eye on the managerial side of stuff, like basic stuff, like checking people's APs, like so that was always a challenge, and just like general like tidiness of something too, like when you have that many people in a space, because it's like you think, oh well, there's like 10 allocated spaces, they're perhaps not filled all the time. You maybe have like 70% of that filled 90% of the time. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more, but then you have the artist that's working there, but they're going to have a whole community around them. Each individual is going to have friends and family, or clients that want to come up. So there's a lot of people going through the space all of the time, and it's difficult to kind of keep control of that. You can't keep control of that. And where it was located, like at the top of Queen Street, like right next to K Road, there's a lot of people that want to come through. There's a lot of people that want to hang out. There's a lot of people that want to come and party, you know, and it's like a 24/7 space. With free car parking, free Wi-Fi, like basically in the middle of the town. Like people started sleeping there, you know. I slept there. I certainly passed out there more times than I can count, you know, and it just like started to erode like the professionalism or the dedication of it as a workspace, and it became more of like a hangout space, which is fine, but just hadn't really been the objective that I'd set out to pursue. And yeah, I think my involvement started to have less of a positive effect, and my ability to kind of contribute what I wanted to really diminished, like my capacity for it just completely fucked out, and I had to step away. And again, it's like similar to what happened with the shop. It's like these things end, and at the time it can feel quite brutal, like, but perhaps if I had been older or wiser or had some guidance, I might have known to step away sooner in both of those situations, and realised that it wasn't working for me. And the best way for me to contribute to a community is to actually do my best work and to be the best person that I can be, and not to think like I think this one was like looking back, and I did have conversations with people like Tourette's and stuff about this at the time. Like, is it an arrogance on my part to believe that I can help people and that I can assist people on their journey? And that's something that I still question. And ultimately, I think just like it's important to take responsibility for myself first before I can take anything else on. And it's like, the more that I look into that, the more I realize how much development I have to do personally and how far away I am from actually being in a position to do any of those big ambitious things I did back then. But it was that naivety that allowed me to do those things in the first place, like just dumb faith in doing what the fuck you want to do.
So alongside all of the administrative work and managing Method and Manners, were you doing predominantly mural work at this time, or was it predominantly studio practice?
So when I was managing the studios, I was doing an array of illustration work, more so than murals. And I had kind of tried to separate out, like I tried to kind of get rid of graffiti out of my life after the shop shut. But then obviously I met those people in Sydney, but yeah, everything kind of comes back to it in a weird way. Right. So one of the things that happened around that time was I got my first kind of major wall, and it was in Tauranga, and it was something that Owen Dippy had actually rejected. But to me, I was like, this is a fucking mean job. And I bought way too much paint. And I went down and like smashed this wall, and it's like, okay, cool. Like I didn't realize that these sorts of jobs were available. You know, I'd done small mural commissions before, but nothing to this scale. And I ended up with excess paint, and I ended up selling paint out of my house again. So things kind of went really weirdly 360. And yeah, the other thing that I was doing was illustration for like band graphics or fashion designers, and just trying to piece things together. It was very much like very scrappy little jobs.
And looking online, I saw a quote from you that you said you don't enjoy art or music rooted in irony or elitism. Could you unpack what that means for me?
So I guess what I mean when I say I don't enjoy artwork or music rooted in irony or elitism is that there's this kind of tendency I see sometimes for people to kind of brush everything that they're doing off as like a joke, and it's kind of, to me, it's like skirting around the responsibility for trying to produce your best work. Because if you're just doing it ironically, then you're saying it doesn't fucking matter. But what you do does matter. Like what you do, what you choose to spend your time doing does matter. Obviously, it shapes you as a person. And so I think that's a cop-out. And when I talk about the elitist stuff, I guess what I mean is like work that is produced to be inaccessible to the majority. So it's like, here's this thing that I made that you're too dumb to understand. What a horrible thing to do.
Circling back to your work and interests, I've seen it described as pop surrealism and imaginary realism. Is that how you would describe the aesthetic behind your work?
When I think about my murals and my personal work, like my painting that isn't my illustration practice, pop surrealism and imaginary realism are definitely relevant movements that I associate with. Surrealism, like, you know, obviously Dali is probably the first people people think of, or Frida Kahlo. And so for me, it's kind of, particularly with the murals, like I'm looking at the subject matter or the story that I want to tell. And that's a really uncool thing to do in the fine art world, is to make narrative work. But I like my work to be able to be read, and to have a inwards road for the viewer, whoever that is, whether that's a client or a member of the public. I think that's really important to me. And so I will research into the place where work is going to be, if it's a public artwork, or if it's a particular plant or animal. I might learn about different associations with that, and then build around that in quite a almost an automatic way. So I think sometimes people get frustrated with me if I'm on like a mural festival or something like that, because my design can change when I'm doing it. Like I don't quite know what I'm going to paint until I'm painting it. And that has its challenges, but that's the way that makes me feel like a real artist if I work in this manner. And yeah, I think that gives it its surrealist edge because it has this automatic aspect to it. But the realism is like if I'm doing painting a manta ray, then it's going to look like, you're going to know it's a manta ray. And it's hopefully going to have like a three-dimensional aspect that makes it look as though it's like swimming off the wall if I'm successful in it.
So alongside illustration, I read that you studied a diploma in environment and sustainability some time ago. What did you learn from that program?
So when I did my diploma, there was two key motivators for that. One was to learn more about rongoa, and I guess that's called in Western scientific is like an ethnobotanical subject. So you're looking at people's relationship to plants. I don't really like that term. But the course also went into, peoples of America and other places, and that is something that I still have a really great interest in, perhaps dating back to like my Nana's florist shop and that early inspiration. And then also because I couldn't understand when I saw these Latin names associated with a plant or an animal, I didn't get it, like I couldn't figure out what it meant, and I wanted to know what that meant so that I could talk about things properly. So it's like, Cody, for example, being Agathis australis, what does that mean? Why does it have this other name? And I could see that would then have a family, and then but it's also a gymnosperm, and from what I could gather online, I didn't even know that was called nomenclature. I didn't know that each species has a binomial name, or why, or what that meant. And so I needed to kind of brush up and, buck up and like just take the plunge into this new area if I was going to be representing these subjects. I needed to know more about them.
Amongst the studio work, you also developed a book project called Toho. Could you explain what those illustrations and book project was about?
Yeah, so that book project actually developed out of doing the course, I think. So one of the things that I figured when I was doing this, because it's actually to do the papers that I wanted to do, I had to do this whole diploma to get the student loan, right? And I'm doing this at the same time as I'm doing other illustration jobs. I'm studying this diploma at home. And one of the things we had to do was write about threatened species, like do a report on, like choose a thing, do a report. And so I chose the peka the bat. And I had kind of heard that there was a bat, but I didn't really know that there was definitely a bat. We actually have two different species. There was a third, which has gone extinct. A lot of people now know of the peka tauroa, which is the long-tailed bat, because that won Bird of the Year. But then there's also the short-tailed bat, or the Cody bat, which is lesser known, and that only likes the old-growth kauri forest. So both of these bats are threatened with extinction, and both of them only exist here. And when I was trying to find illustrations of these for my essays and stuff, there was some drawings dating back to like maybe two drawings from the 1800s, and they only had like the Latin names that they had at the time, which are now completely out of date, and also they were anatomically incorrect, and they had no Maori names or associations in the text that went along with those illustrations. So it's like, okay, here is this massive gap. Here is this huge gap, and I've lived here my entire life and I've never fucking heard of these things, and there's no information, and I'm looking up all these different websites trying to find stuff. So if somebody wasn't in the same position that I'm in, where they get to do this stuff full time, and they wanted to know, how the fuck are they going to know? It's not in schools. There's no accessibility to this information. So I really could see that there was a need there. And I wanted to paint these things because they were beautiful and they were cool. And then I just kept doing that. Yeah, so actually after I'd painted these bats, as best I could from what photos I could find online, I had two different opportunities. One was to go to the Auckland Zoo and meet a keeper there who had a pair of the Kauri bat in captivity and see her feeding and weighing them. And then another opportunity to go out into the Waitakares, which was still under Rahui at that time, but because they were monitoring the bats for research, they had a special permit to go in there, and I was invited to come along and see how that process worked. So they set up what's called a harp trap, where it's this kind of thin nylon, it's like a harp, imagine like the metal frame, nylon strings, the bat flies into it, doesn't hurt it, but it makes it fall down into a net below, and then they can look at it, measure it, put a little tracking device on its back and set it free again, and it eventually falls off. That was just so cool to see these things in real life. It's like proof, you know, because often like the species that we closely associate with Kiwi identity are like an enigma for the majority of the population. They're things that people don't get to see. You know, people are in town, people are working like 60 hours a week. They don't have these opportunities that I'm really, really, really fortunate to have now. And so for me, sharing those experiences with people is really key. It's not just for me, you know, it's for everybody. And so I try to find different ways of circulating not just the information, but also the experiences that I'm having with a greater audience and with people that are interested.
While doing all of your studio work, you're also a member of the New Zealand Botanical Society. Could you tell me a little bit about what your involvement with that group is?
So there's BotSoc is a thing, which is the Botanical Society, and there'll be BotSoc chapters around the country. So, and these are a group of plant enthusiasts that not necessarily like have any academic background, but they like it and they get together and they talk about stuff. And then there's the Botanical Art Society, which is different again because it's a national thing, but people are based all around the country, and it's people that are interested in painting plants, basically.
So it's predominantly artists that are interested in the subject matter, right?
Yeah, the Botanical Art Society is literally a group of people that paint plants. Yeah, and generally native plants. And I think because in terms of like, it's such a European tradition, botanical art, it really is. It's something that's come over like with colonization, and you know, it didn't exist prior to that in the way that we think about what it is. But because it's such a new, like the flora here is so new within that tradition, and so the first people that were drawing plants under this tradition were like Banks and Solander, who came across on the Endeavour and collected plant specimens and drew them, and you know, there was this whole big process of them producing the Florilegium, which is the first collection of prints relating to native plants. And if you imagine that this tradition has gone on for maybe another century or so or longer back in Europe, and then that went from being like a very science heavy focus, where it was almost like dudes wanted to have ownership of being the first person to see a plant. They'd be like, this is a different type of fern, I'm gonna name it after myself. You know, like this whole kind of like naming something has like this weird kind of a bit yuck ownership thing associated with it in some ways, and then painting things can be that as well, but it kind of shifted over from it being like that side of things to then being actually quite female led, with people just painting stuff out of appreciation and love for the subject. So they're not trying to like say, this is Fanny's rose, this is just like Fanny likes this rose, you know, so she's going to paint it. And that kind of maybe weirdly also goes back to this kind of colonial woman subject matter as well, like whereas this is like something that's also encouraged in female artists, is to paint flowers and plants, which I've you know is tricky for me to get my head around. But anyway, what do? We paint things so that people can see what things are, and so it's like by our close observation, it's allowing others to have that same experience, but without the pain of going through and having to paint it. So you can look, so basically a botanical illustration will show the habit of a plant. So you might imagine if you cut off a branch or a twiglet of a tree, right? And then it's got the leaves coming off it. So it's going to show where and how those leaves connect to the stem. It's going to show the flower, what the flower parts look like in an ideal world before some insects eaten it or whatever. So it's still got all its petals in the correct color and the correct arrangement with the stamens. And so all of these things are called morphological characteristics. So they're the physical characteristics that make that thing visibly different to another thing that might be really closely related, and allows you to differentiate. And then of course after that, people can go to a genetic level and look at that thing under the microscope and maybe perhaps discover that things that are morphologically the same might actually be entirely different species. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yep, for sure. And I guess maybe jumping forward in the timeline just a little bit, you recently did a collaboration with Blunt Umbrellas. What has it been like working with a company like this? And could you tell me a little bit about the concept of your umbrella design?
Forest and Bird and Blunt Umbrellas are working together, and Blunt Umbrellas basically gives a percentage of the sales of the umbrella to Forest and Bird, which allows Forest and Bird to continue their work advocating for the environment, basically, in different ways. Having this special anniversary, they wanted to do something which paired artwork of or images of some of the native plants and animals that they're working hard to protect for everybody, really, for perpetuity. And so luckily, I don't know, do you want to know how it happened, or so basically I'd met Lynn Freeman from RNZ a few years ago. She interviewed me for something, and then I went and hung out with her in Zealandia where she volunteers, and we walked around. She also works with Forest and Bird. She's a very, very busy, very capable lady. I think she must have put me forward as one of the artists to work on this project, and so they contacted me and asked me if I'd like to collaborate, which of course I would love to, because I really support their work, and it's a great way for me to be able to contribute again to something that I see as being really valuable to society. And and when it came down to the plant selection, that was a little bit harder. Like, I wanted to have stuff from both the North and the South Island, and then also the bird, the toho. So I'd actually been asked to just do plant species, just do like the flora, which would have been fine. But I really wanted to have the toho, the wax-eye bird, the Zosterops lateralis, because that's kind of like my I have a special debt to that bird. And so they agreed to that, and came up with a design that looked as though everything's kind of swirling around like in a little windy eddy. So lots of like as if everything's just been picked up by a light breeze and is getting swirled around. And so it actually works like an animation, so that when you spin the umbrella, the bird is in different stages of motion, so it looks as though it's flying around. Well, that's the concept anyway. So it does all kind of come back down to that. And weirdly, the animation stuff has been leaking back into my practice. It seems like these things do go full circle.
That's awesome to see the lived experiences of, I guess, life lessons coming back through into what we do. But on a slightly different tangent, I saw that you had designed a sculpture also for the Auckland Council called Kid Justice. Could you tell me what that project involved, and maybe what the process was for creating such a large sculpture object?
So Kid Justice came about as in response to a call out through the Auckland Council Arts team for a public sculpture to commemorate women's suffrage in New Zealand, which is women being granted the vote. Obviously, we're the first country where that happened, so it's a real point of difference, and something that should be celebrated. So it's like, wow, women being equal. Who would have thunk? But the women's suffrage movement was tied in with a bunch of other stuff as well. The people that were active in trying to get that across the board were also, interested in animal rights. And it's not just about like woman as equal, it's more about human rights and about equality. And so I was thinking about what that looks like moving forward. So kind of tying in the past, present, future aspects of suffrage as a concept, and some of the key imagery that's associated with women's suffrage was like the Greek mythology of Sisyphus, who's like perpetually trying to push this boulder up a hill. So this is like the woman, there'd be these little cartoons of women trying to push the boulder, which says suffrage on it, up a hill. And I thought, well, that's quite good. And then also the figure of justice was another image that is quite strong throughout the suffrage movement. And so I wanted to kind of combine these different things, but then have it more contemporary, like what it would look like now, how we think about gods and goddesses, and how those are visually represented in our culture. And you think about like superhero movies or like Pixar films where like the kid is the hero, and I wanted to oppose what I see in those sort of mainstream things where it's like somebody with like, I wanted to kind of have a figure that stood in opposition to what we're sold as idealized imagery, particularly of the female form. So I wanted to be like a young female leaning, I don't want to gender anyone. So it's just a kid justice. And so she has the scales, instead of holding the scales, they are etched into her palm. And then in her other arm, she's holding the ballot roll, which is all the signatures for people voting for women to have voting. And she's standing on top of a boulder, and it's in a park, or it was in a park in Howick, at the bottom of what is essentially the Fencibles Hill. So I don't know if you know, when you go into Howick, they still have a monument there to the Fencibles, which is like the people that, it was the British side of the land wars, basically. And so it's kind of like it's one of those things that's very contentious. And it was chosen as a strategic place because you can see anyone coming around into the harbour. And so anyway, they have this big monument. It's still there. It's kind of fucked. And so the boulder that she's standing on is like at the bottom of the hill. It isn't up there where these kind of equal values should or could be, so there's still work to be done. But the budget was quite limited in terms of producing a public artwork. I say it's only 30 grand. This became an issue in the media once it was installed. But if you think about the scale of what they had wanted, what they asked for in terms of producing a public artwork, it's a permanent or semi-permanent artwork. What materials are available to produce something like this? And fiberglass was really the only viable financial option. And also I was only given something like 6 months or something to produce the whole thing. So I ended up working with, like, going through different film set companies actually, and I came across Bootleg, and they agreed to produce it within the budget. And so, because obviously you have to have structural engineers and stuff approve the whole thing, and that's a huge chunk of the cost right there. Before you've even done anything, you have to build a steel frame for it to go over and have that approved to say it's not going to fall on anyone and kill them. So anyway, we went through the process, like I showed them some sketches. I did a 3D model turnaround. Hey! And worked with one of the younger people on their team who actually produced a model, and I adjusted it based on the drawings, and made the cast, and then it was installed until it was vandalized multiple times on multiple occasions. Basically, as soon as it went in, it was a problem. This was one of like 4 different projects that council was trying to organise with different public artworks for these new sites that they have, where they've built a concrete pad, and the idea is that artworks can go in, stay for 5 years, and then get rotated out. And they'd chosen specifically from this like mapping that they'd done of where there's like not enough public art, they'd chosen their spaces as being pivotal. And so none of the other projects that they had commissioned as part of this call that I responded to were anywhere near completion. Mine was the only one that was like going to be done on time. So they were like, let's get it in the ground. And I was like, cool, but have we talked to the community? Is it in the newspaper? Does anyone know? It was not. And I was kind of told, it's not your place. You don't worry about that. You do your bit, we do our bit. But there's obviously a lot of pressure on all the different stakeholders for it to go in the ground and to show, because it's to mark an occasion that is an annual, it has a date on it. Anyway, they chucked it in there. It looked cool. I was stoked. And then immediately one of the people from the local board started talking smack on it on social media, on Facebook, saying, what is this? This is so ugly. Can you believe council spent so much money on this thing? What a waste of money. It's like in the eye line to the harbour from these houses in Howick. We don't like it. Tell me if you like it or not. And so this is coming from a young Nat MP as well, which is hilarious. Young white Nat MP being like, we don't like this woman's suffrage sculpture. Wow, what a fucking shock. What a huge shock. And so then all of his like patrons or whatever are then jumping on there being like, nah, it's a load of shit. We hate this. And it's like, oh, okay, cool. And so then Stuff NZ like finds this and then they repost his post and then they have like a poll going of like whether this is a piece of shit artwork or not. And I'm phoning council. I'm like, what is going on? Like, this is my name. Like, I'm not getting paid anywhere near enough for this to be happening. This is insane. Am I going to get work after this? I don't know what's going on. And then somebody came and they cut her toes off, first of all. Yeah. And so the sculpture had to be taken out and be repaired. And then somebody broke her arm off. And this thing's got a steel armature as well. And then it had to get taken out and be repaired. And basically there was just like every time it would go in, something would happen. And so the upkeep of like this, it just obviously wasn't going to be viable. So they ended up taking it out. I think it's in storage somewhere. They did offer it back to me. I don't really have the capacity to, but I rent, man. Like I'd have to then every time like try and figure out how to move this object and find another place that's suitable for it. Maybe it could go to Westlake Girls. Who knows? Yeah.
Love it. All right, Erin. Well, thank you so much for your time. And maybe just in closing, are there any shout outs or acknowledgements that you'd like to make?
Well, thanks for taking the time to interview me, Bobby. And also I want to shout out to the RFCs, of course, particularly my painting buddies, Gasp and PMT. And then, Helper, if you're listening, and Funny Boy, if not that he will, but hi. SWBs in Sydney. Just everyone that you engage with like has a small bearing on the direction that your life can take. And I think I just want to acknowledge that how just like fractional shifts can make a huge difference over time.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Erin. I think that's a wrap for our conversation. But I really just wanted to thank you so much for sharing your stories, experiences, and journey of your life as a creative person. It's been really amazing to hear about all the different hats you've actually put on over the years, from being an artist to owning your own store to running artist spaces. It's awesome to see the path that you're on right now and how you've positioned your practice and research in the kind of botanical kind of space. So to our audience, if you've managed to sit through the entire video, we hope that was insightful. And once again, a huge thanks to Ed from Eke Panuku Development for funding this project and continuing to enable public art to be accessible for the community. We hope that providing the pavilion as a platform for artists to showcase their work can help to enrich some of the spaces which are used by the community. So thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode of the Pavilion Project.